They scanned the canopy from orbit and saw the densest, least populated, least monitored stretch of wilderness on the entire planet, and concluded, with total confidence, that they had found the perfect place to build a base nobody would ever notice. What their sensors couldn't measure was that least populated did not mean least occupied, and that the Amazon rainforest had spent 40 million years perfecting the art of noticing things that didn't belong, then quietly, patiently, taking them apart. If you like watching an overconfident empire get slowly disassembled by an ecosystem that never even raised its voice, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me the creepiest thing you've ever heard about the rainforest. Now let's get into it, because in about 30 seconds, the Threx Dominion is going to learn what it means to build a base somewhere that already has an owner. Site Commander Vrenna Ak had overseen the construction of forward operating bases on 11 separate worlds before this one, and every engineering survey loaded into her tactical display told her the same reassuring story. Dense, unmapped terrain was ideal cover, difficult for a primitive species to patrol, easy for an advanced one to conceal a base within, and according to every metric her species had ever used to judge a construction site, essentially undefended. Her chief engineer, a meticulous, soft-spoken officer named Dasa, floated a data slate in front of her showing a satellite scan of an unbroken green canopy stretching to every horizon, threaded by a single wide brown river. Site selected, Commander. Remote basin terrain, minimal human infrastructure within 400 kilometers, canopy cover sufficient to conceal all major structures from orbital and atmospheric detection. Dasa tapped the slate, and the image zoomed into a small clearing beside a tributary, already flagged in blue as the proposed construction zone. Local population density near zero. No roads. No permanent settlements within immediate range. Weapons signatures detected, negligible, consistent with small-scale hand tools. Vrenna studied the readout with the calm satisfaction of a commander who had learned to recognize an easy-build site by its emptiness. And the biological survey. Dasa hesitated, the particular hesitation of an engineer who has technically completed a task, without being entirely comfortable with how little time he'd had to do it properly. Preliminary only, Commander. The scan flagged an extremely high density of distinct life forms per square kilometer, the highest of any site in our current survey catalog, by a significant margin, but categorized the overwhelming majority as small, non-threatening fauna. Insects, amphibians, birds. Nothing registering above what our threat models classify as negligible. Then proceed, Vrenna said. A jungle is not an army. Begin construction immediately. I want the primary structure operational within 6 local days. What neither Vrenna nor Dasa's survey could measure, because nothing in the Threx engineering manuals had ever needed a category for it, was that the highest density of distinct life forms per square kilometer of any site in the catalog was not a footnote. It was the entire threat assessment, compressed into a single sentence that a more careful reader might have paused over rather than skimmed past on the way to a construction timeline. The first landing barge came down through the canopy at dawn, cutting a rough clearing with directed energy tools that felled ancient trees in seconds, work that would have taken a human logging crew with heavy machinery the better part of a week. Within 2 hours, a prefabricated perimeter wall had gone up around a growing cluster of matte black structures, and Vrenna stood at its center, surveying the scorched clearing with the particular satisfaction of a commander watching a plan execute exactly on schedule. Structural integrity at 90%, Dasa reported. Primary shield generator online. Perimeter sensors active. Casualties? None, Commander. Local fauna has kept a consistent distance from the construction zone. Dasa paused, checking a secondary readout. Though sensor logs are recording an unusually high volume of vocalizations from the surrounding canopy, birds, insects, and what our translation matrix believes may be several species of primate. Noise, Vrenna said, nothing more. It was not, strictly speaking, nothing more. Roughly 400 meters from the perimeter wall, in a research station that predated the Threk's arrival by 11 years, a field biologist named Dr. Marisol Ferreira sat up sharply at her recording station, headphones still on, staring at a spectrogram that had just done something her spectrogram had never done in over a decade of monitoring this stretch of forest. An entire quadrant of the soundscape bird-song insect chorus, the low background hum of a healthy rainforest at first light, had gone almost completely silent within the span of 90 seconds, replaced by a new, layered pattern of alarm calls radiating outward from a single point like ripples from a stone dropped in water. "That's not a jaguar alarm," she said out loud to nobody because her research assistant, a quiet, exacting graduate student named Theo Lavigne, was still asleep in the next room. "That's not anything I've got on file." She pulled up the directional data, cross-referenced it against the station's motion-triggered camera array, and found nothing. No image, no movement, just an absence where the forest's normal texture of sound should have been, radiating from a location roughly 400 meters northeast, in a section of forest so remote, and so rarely surveyed that the station's own maps simply labeled it in her own handwriting from years earlier, unvisited, dense understory. By mid-morning, the base's perimeter sensors were logging their first genuine anomalies, though nothing serious enough to interrupt construction. A supply technician named Krell, running a routine equipment check along the outer wall, paused at a section where the freshly cleared ground had already begun to show a strange, spreading discoloration, a dark webbing pattern threading up through the churned soil from somewhere beneath. "Commander, Section 4 is showing unusual growth activity along the foundation line." Vrenna glanced at the readout without much concern. "Vegetation regrowth, log it and continue." It was not, in fact, vegetation regrowth in any sense the Threk's engineering manuals had a category for. It was mycelium, a vast, ancient, interconnected fungal network that had occupied that particular stretch of soil for longer than the Threk's dominion itself had existed as a spacefaring civilization, a network that had, in the span of a single morning, registered an enormous foreign chemical and thermal disturbance at its edge, and begun doing what it had always done to anything that disrupted its territory, surrounding it, testing it, and slowly, patiently, beginning to break it down. By the second day, 3 separate structural supports along the base's southern wall were reporting minor degradation in their foundation bonding, an anomaly DASA attributed, with the confidence of an engineer who had built on 11 other worlds and never once encountered this specific problem, to soil moisture content higher than the initial survey had accounted for. "Reinforce and continue," Vrenna said when the report reached her. "We are still ahead of schedule." She was, in fact, still ahead of schedule, right up until the moment a maintenance crew clearing brush along the eastern perimeter for a planned sensor array discovered that an entire section of newly cleared ground had, overnight, been reclaimed by root systems growing at a rate their botanical database flatly refused to classify as biologically plausible. Roots that had, in the space of 12 hours, worked their way beneath 3 separate equipment crates and tipped one of them fully onto its side. Dr. Ferreira, meanwhile, had spent her second day doing what any careful researcher does when their instruments show something impossible. She checked her equipment first, assumed operator error second, and only on the third pass, when the anomaly refused to resolve itself under any conventional explanation, allowed herself to consider that something was actually happening 400 meters northeast of her station. She woke Theo at 4 in the morning, not out of urgency exactly, but because in 11 years of field work she had learned that the forest rarely announced anything this loudly without a reason worth losing sleep over. "I need a second set of eyes on this," she said, sliding her tablet across the table. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." Theo studied the data for a long moment, adjusted his glasses, and said, with the particular flatness of a graduate student trying very hard not to sound alarmed. You're not reading it wrong. Something the size of a small building appeared in the canopy density scan overnight, and it's radiating heat, and the entire forest around it is behaving like it's under attack. Under attack by what? I don't know, Marisol. I've never seen a heat signature shaped like that in 11 field seasons, and neither have you. They did not call the authorities that first morning, mostly because neither of them had the faintest idea what authority would be appropriate to call about a heat-emitting structure that had appeared overnight in one of the most remote, least accessible stretches of forest on the continent. 4 days hard travel from the nearest permanent road. Instead, they did what field researchers had always done when faced with something they couldn't explain. They packed a satellite radio, 2 weeks of supplies, and a single very good camera, and began, cautiously, to hike toward it. By the third day, the base's problems had stopped being isolated incidents and started becoming a pattern that even Dasa, with all his careful engineering optimism, could no longer explain away individually. A drainage channel dug along the northern wall to redirect groundwater had been colonized overnight by a colony of leafcutter ants numbering, by the base's own sensor estimate, somewhere in the low millions. Workers stripping the plastic sheathing from an exposed cable run with the same patient, mechanical efficiency they applied to stripping leaves. Because to a leafcutter ant, a cable sheath was simply an unusually stubborn leaf. Cable integrity at 71% along the northern relay, Dasa reported, an edge of genuine concern entering his voice for the first time. Insect activity is, Commander, I want to be precise about this, extraordinarily coordinated. It does not resemble opportunistic foraging. It resembles a deliberate, systematic dismantling of specific infrastructure. Insects do not have strategy, Vrenna said, though she said it with slightly less certainty than she had said anything else that week. No, Commander, but something is directing their proximity to our most vital systems with a consistency I cannot attribute to chance. Nothing was, in fact, directing the ants at all, in any sense Vrenna would have recognized as command. The forest simply worked the way it had always worked. An enormous, ancient, interconnected system of fungal signaling, chemical trails, and evolutionary instinct that treated any large foreign object disrupting its chemistry as exactly what it was, a wound, a blockage, a foreign body, and responded the way it had responded to fallen trees, dead animals, and geological disruptions for tens of millions of years, by sending in everything capable of breaking it down and recycling it back into the system. The Threx base did not require a predator. It required patience, and the Amazon had more patience than any species that had ever tried to build something inside it. By the fourth day, Vrenna ordered a full perimeter sweep, less because she believed there was an organized threat, and more because she needed the report to say something other than insect activity and structural anomaly before she filed her progress update to Fleet Command. The sweep team, 6 soldiers under an officer named Trask, moved out along the eastern tree line and encountered within the first 200 meters the actual physical difficulty of moving through primary rainforest understory in full combat armor, vines that seemed to catch on every joint, ground that gave way unpredictably beneath standing water and root systems. A canopy so dense overhead that their orbital link navigation flickered in and out with every few steps. It was Trask's team that found the wasps. Not a swarm exactly, not at first. A single, curious scout wasp, drawn by the unfamiliar chemical signature of Threx sweat analog secreted under armor plating during exertion, landing briefly on a soldier's exposed neck seam before being brushed away. It was, on its own, nothing. It was also, unfortunately for Trask's team, a scent marker, one of several dozen species in that stretch of forest that communicated threat and food location through chemical trails Other members of their colony could follow with total precision from significant distances. By the time Trask's team had covered another 300 meters, they had picked up an escort. "Commander," Trask radioed, voice carefully controlled in the way of an officer trying not to sound as alarmed as he felt. "We are being followed by what our sensors are identifying as a coordinated swarm. Estimated population in the low thousands. They are maintaining distance but have not dispersed despite repeated evasive maneuvers." "Are they attacking?" "Not directly, Commander. They appear to be waiting." They were not, strictly speaking, waiting for anything except an opportunity, which arrived 4 minutes later when one soldier, attempting to duck beneath a low branch, caught his weapon barrel against a paper wasp nest roughly the size of a beach ball hanging directly in his path. A nest that had, until that exact moment, gone completely undetected by every sensor his armor carried. Because Threck's sensor arrays had never once been calibrated to distinguish papery gray plant matter from actual plant matter. What followed was, by Trask's own later account, the single fastest tactical retreat of his career, conducted at a dead sprint through terrain that fought every step of the way. 6 fully armored soldiers pursued not by a coordinated enemy force, but by several thousand individually enraged insects operating on pure chemical instinct. An experience that Trask would describe in his after-action report using a phrase that Vrenna found, on reflection, unusually poetic for a combat log. "The forest did not send an army, it simply stopped protecting us from itself." Dr. Ferreira and Theo, meanwhile, had covered roughly 2/3 of the distance to the anomaly by the 4th day, moving carefully along game trails and the edges of the tributary, and had begun to notice something themselves, a strange, spreading disturbance in the forest's normal rhythm, patches where insect activity was unusually dense, sections of canopy where birds had gone conspicuously silent, and more than once, evidence of large equipment having recently and violently disturbed ground that should, by every map either of them had ever consulted, have been completely untouched by human activity. "This isn't a mining operation," Theo said, crouched beside a churned section of soil that showed tool marks unlike anything in his experience. "Mining leaves a signature. This doesn't match any extraction pattern I've ever studied." "I don't think it's human at all," Marisol said, quietly, studying a fragment of scorched, matte black material half buried in the mud material that felt, when she picked it up, unlike any plastic, metal, or composite she'd handled in 11 field seasons. By the 5th day, Vrenna's base was, by every objective measure available to DASA's engineering readouts, losing a war it had never officially declared against an enemy that had never once fired a shot. Structural corrosion, initially dismissed as a moisture anomaly, had spread to 9 separate load-bearing points, accelerated by a persistent, invisible film of fungal growth that DASA's analysis finally, reluctantly identified as actively metabolizing the polymer sealant used in every joint across the entire structure. The northern cable relay had failed completely, chewed through by ants that had, in the intervening days, apparently decided the entire perimeter fence was simply an unusually large and satisfying leaf. And the perimeter itself had become, for any soldier assigned to patrol it, a kind of slow-motion gauntlet of biting insects, aggressive territorial birds who had decided the base's exposed wiring made excellent nesting material. And on one particularly unfortunate occasion, a fertilance that had taken up residence in a supply crate and greeted the soldier who opened it with exactly the reaction 11 million years of evolution had prepared it to give anything that disturbed its rest. "Report," Vrenna said, standing at the center of a base that increasingly resembled, in DASA's own private assessment, something being slowly digested. "Commander, I want to be direct with you," DASA said, and something in his tone made her actually listen rather than simply hear. "We are not being attacked by a single organized force. We are being attacked by everything, simultaneously, in small, uncoordinated increments, none of which individually threatens the base, all of which collectively are dismantling it faster than we can repair it. I have never encountered an ecosystem that behaves this way. Every previous world we have built on has had predators, has had threats, has had things we could identify, target, and remove. This one simply has everything all at once all the time, indifferent to our presence except insofar as we are, apparently, edible, corrodable, or in the way. Vrenna considered this report longer than she had considered any single piece of data in 11 successful base constructions. You are telling me the jungle itself is the enemy. I am telling you, Commander, that there is no meaningful distinction here between the jungle and an enemy. It does not need to be commanded. It does not need to be motivated. It only needs time, and we have been giving it exactly that continuously for 5 days. On the 6th day, Dr. Ferreira and Theo finally reached a ridge overlooking the clearing, and got their first direct visual confirmation of what the readings had been describing all along. A scorched, half-collapsed compound, matte black structures listing at odd angles where their foundations had failed. A perimeter wall visibly overgrown in places with a strange, dense webbing of fungal growth. And figures, tall, armored, moving with the unmistakable posture of soldiers rather than researchers, patrolling a base that looked, from that distance, less like a secret installation and more like a structure actively losing a fight against the ground it had been built on. Marisol, Theo said quietly, lowering his camera, I don't think we're looking at a mining operation. No, she agreed, I don't think we are. They did not approach further. They photographed what they could from the ridge, recorded coordinates, and began, with considerably more urgency than their outbound hike, the long trip back toward the research station and its satellite radio, both of them independently reaching the same conclusion. That whatever this was, it was well beyond the scope of anything either of them had the authority or the desire to investigate alone. Vrenna made her decision on the sieve. Nth day, standing in a command structure whose internal atmospheric seals had, that morning, finally failed along a seam DOS's team had reinforced 4 separate times without success. She reviewed the cumulative reports. 3 soldiers hospitalized from insect stings and 1 venomous bite. Structural integrity across the entire base now below 40%. 2 full supply crates lost entirely to termite colonies that had apparently mistaken the crates' reinforced wooden pallets for an unusually promising nesting opportunity. And a northern relay system that had been rebuilt and rechewed through by ants on 3 separate occasions. And reached the same conclusion Site Commander, after Site Commander would reach on this world for the rest of Threk's history, once they'd finally read the reports of the ones who came before them. Full evacuation, she said, effective immediately. It was not called a retreat in her official log. It was called, and she was very particular about the exact wording, environmental incompatibility relocation, effective upon structural failure exceeding sustainable repair thresholds. The evacuation itself took the better part of a full day, hampered at every stage by the same accumulated small disasters that had defined the entire operation. A supply barge whose landing struts had partially sunk into ground that had, over a week, been quietly softened by root systems working beneath it. A communications array that refused to power down cleanly because a colony of termites had, in the preceding 72 hours, hollowed out nearly a third of its internal housing. A final headcount delayed 20 minutes because 1 soldier had to be located and extracted from a supply tent where he had, in a moment Trask's after-action report described with visible reluctance, become genuinely and thoroughly stuck to a support pole by a length of vine that had grown, with what felt to him at the time like deliberate malice, directly around his ankle while he stood still doing an equipment check. The last barge lifted off just after dusk on the 7th day, rising unsteadily through a canopy that seemed, in DOS's final sensor sweep, almost immediately indifferent to its departure, birdsong and insect chorus already resuming their normal rhythm within minutes, as though the entire 7-day engagement had registered in the forest's own vast and patient accounting as barely worth remembering. Dr. Ferreira and Theo, 3 days into their return trip and still well short of the research station, heard the barge's engines pass somewhere overhead through a break in the canopy, looked up in time to see nothing but a fading trail of displaced air against the evening sky, and exchanged a long look that neither of them fully put into words for several more days, right up until they finally reached a signal strong enough to make the calls that would, eventually, bring an entire team of far better funded, far better equipped researchers out to a clearing that, by the time any one official arrived 3 weeks later, had already been substantially reclaimed by exactly the process that had driven its original occupants away. Site Commander Vrenna Ock filed her report to the Threx Dominion High Command later that month. It was short and unusually honest for a commander not generally inclined toward admitting failure. Recommendation, she wrote. Do not construct any installation within this biome. The threat here cannot be identified, targeted, or negotiated with, because it is not a single threat at all. It is the accumulated, indifferent action of an entire ecosystem operating exactly as it always has, entirely unaware of us as anything other than raw material. We were not defeated by an army. We were defeated by fungus, by insects, by root systems, by rot, operating on timescales and in numbers our doctrine has never once been designed to counter. Conventional defense assumes an enemy that can be deterred. This environment cannot be deterred. It can only be outlasted, and we did not have the patience it demanded of us. The High Command read the report twice, marked the coordinates for permanent avoidance, and added beneath Vrenna's recommendation a line that would be quoted in Threx engineering academies for the next 100 years. Never build where the ground itself has already decided what belongs there. It will not fight you directly. It will simply take its time, and it has more time than you do. Chief Engineer Dasa was quietly reassigned to survey work on considerably less biologically dense worlds for the remainder of his career, a transfer he requested personally, citing in his own words a newfound and, in his estimation, entirely reasonable preference for terrain that could be reduced to a stable set of engineering variables rather than an ever-shifting, endlessly patient accumulation of living things that had never once needed to notice him in order to defeat him. Dr. Marisol Ferrer spent the following 2 years leading a research consortium studying the scorched, partially reclaimed clearing, publishing findings that carefully avoided the more difficult questions the site raised, focusing instead on the extraordinary speed and thoroughness of the forest's natural reclamation process. A paper that would go on to be cited for years afterward by ecologists studying resilience and regrowth, none of whom ever learned from the paper itself exactly what it was the forest had been reclaiming the site from. Theo Lavigne finished his graduate degree the following spring, based substantially on data from that same expedition, and would tell, for the rest of his academic career, a slightly different version of the story depending on the audience. One for conferences, and one, considerably closer to the truth, reserved for the handful of people he trusted enough to believe him. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling me the strangest thing you've ever read about the rainforest. Smash that like button, subscribe if you want more of these, and share this with a friend who still won't go camping because of a documentary about the Amazon. See you in the next one.